Imagine sitting across from someone who smiles warmly at you, compliments your ideas, and makes you feel like the most important person in the room. But behind those friendly eyes, they're calculating your every weakness, mapping out how to use your trust against you. This isn't a thriller movie. This is real life. And the blueprint for this kind of psychological manipulation was written over 500 years ago by a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning and ruthless strategy. Niccolò Machiavelli didn't just write about politics. He wrote about human nature itself. And what he discovered about power and psychology is so disturbing, so effective, that it's still being used today by CEOs, politicians, and anyone who wants to climb to the top. But here's the thing, you're probably not ready for what you're about to learn. Because once you understand these psychological tactics, you'll start seeing them everywhere. In your workplace, your relationships, even in your own behavior. Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, is often misunderstood. People think it's a simple guide to being cruel and manipulative. But that's surface-level thinking. The real genius of Machiavelli lies in his understanding of human psychology. He observed that humans are fundamentally driven by fear and desire. Not love, not loyalty, not honor, but fear and desire. And if you can master these two forces in others, you can control them completely. Think about your own life for a moment. How many of your decisions are really driven by what you want versus what you're afraid of losing? Your job, your relationships, your social status, how much of it is maintained through fear rather than genuine choice? Machiavelli saw this clearly. He wrote that people are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. Harsh words, but look around you. How many people do you know who would throw you under the bus if it meant saving themselves? Here's where it gets really dark. Machiavelli argued that it's better to be feared than loved, if you can't be both. But this isn't just about intimidation. It's about psychological conditioning. When you make someone fear the consequences of disappointing you, you create a mental prison. They start policing their own behavior, constantly worried about your reaction. They become their own jailer. Modern psychology calls this learned helplessness. You don't need to constantly threaten someone. You just need to establish the pattern once, and their brain will do the rest. They'll anticipate your displeasure and modify their behavior accordingly. This is why toxic bosses are so effective. They don't yell at you every day. They just need to explode once or twice, and you'll spend the rest of your time walking on eggshells, desperately trying to avoid triggering them again. Machiavelli understood this 500 years before we had the scientific language to describe it. He knew that the most powerful control happens inside someone's mind, not through external force. But here's where Machiavelli's psychology gets truly sophisticated. He didn't just advocate for fear. He advocated for the illusion of choice within controlled parameters. Give people options, but make sure all the options serve your interests. Let them feel like they're making decisions, while you're actually orchestrating the entire scenario. This is psychological manipulation at its finest. Think about how this plays out in modern life. Your employer gives you the choice between working late or coming in early. You feel like you have agency, but both choices serve the company's need for more hours from you. Political campaigns do this too. They present you with carefully crafted choices that all lead to the same outcome, your vote and your emotional investment in their narrative. Machiavelli called this appearing to be merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, while being ready to act in the opposite way should circumstances require it. You maintain the facade of giving people freedom while controlling the entire framework within which they operate. Point one of Machiavelli's most psychologically sophisticated insights was about the power of unpredictability. Not chaos, that's just destructive. But calculated unpredictability that keeps people off balance. When people can't predict your reactions, they can't prepare for them. This creates a constant state of vigilance and anxiety. They're always trying to read your mood, anticipate your needs, and position themselves favorably. This is why some of the most successful leaders are hard to read. They're warm and encouraging one day, cold and demanding the next. Not because they're unstable, but because they understand that predictability breeds complacency. Your brain is constantly trying to categorize and predict. When it can't, it defaults to a state of heightened alertness. People in this state are more susceptible to influence because they're desperately seeking cues about how to behave. Machiavelli observed something disturbing about human loyalty. The more someone sacrifices for you, the more loyal they become, not because they love you, but because they need to justify their sacrifices to themselves. This is cognitive dissonance in action. When people invest time, energy, or resources in serving you, they have to convince themselves that you're worth it. Otherwise, they'd have to admit they've been foolish. Smart manipulators understand this. They don't just take from people, they get people to give. They create situations where others feel like they're choosing to help, to sacrifice, to invest. Each investment increases the psychological cost of walking away. Think about toxic relationships. Often, the person being manipulated will defend their abuser, not despite the abuse, but because of everything they've already invested in the relationship. Their brain can't handle the idea that all that investment was wasted. Here's one of Machiavelli's most counterintuitive insights. Sometimes, brutal honesty is the most effective manipulation tool. When you tell someone a harsh truth about themselves or their situation, you establish credibility as someone who tells it like it is. But this honesty is selective and strategic. You're brutally honest about things that don't threaten your position while carefully concealing information that would undermine your control. This creates a psychological bond. People start to trust you as someone who doesn't sugarcoat reality. They begin to rely on your perspective and judgment. But you're only giving them the pieces of reality that serve your purposes. It's like being a drug dealer who gives away the first hit for free. The honesty is the free sample that gets them hooked on your version of reality. Machiavelli understood that people are fundamentally self-centered. They're most interested in themselves and their own problems. So instead of trying to force your agenda on them, you reflect their own desires and fears back at them. You become a mirror that shows them what they want to see. If they want to feel important, you reflect their importance. If they're afraid of failure, you reflect their competence. If they're insecure about their intelligence, you reflect their wisdom. This isn't flattery, it's psychological mapping. You're identifying the core narratives people tell themselves about who they are, and then reinforcing those narratives in ways that serve your interests. The genius is that people think they're seeing themselves clearly, but they're actually seeing a version of themselves that you've carefully crafted to make them more compliant and useful to you. One of Machiavelli's darkest insights was about the power of isolation. Not physical isolation, that's too obvious. Psychological isolation. Making people feel like they're alone in their struggles, their doubts, their fears. When people feel isolated, they become more dependent on whoever offers them connection and understanding. They're more willing to compromise their values, more likely to rationalize bad behavior, more desperate for approval. This is why cult leaders are so effective. They don't just control information, they control social connections. They make people feel like the outside world doesn't understand them, but the leader and the group do. In everyday life, this looks like a boss who makes you feel like you're the only one struggling, or a friend who makes you feel like no one else really gets you. They position themselves as your only source of validation and support. So there you have it, Machiavelli's darkest psychological insights about power and human nature. The manipulation of fear and desire, the illusion of choice, calculated unpredictability, the loyalty trap, selective honesty, the mirror effect, and psychological isolation. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are the tools being used around you right now, in your workplace, your relationships, your social media feeds, your political landscape. But here's the thing, knowledge is power, but it's also responsibility. Understanding these tactics doesn't just help you recognize when they're being used against you. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth about yourself, because once you understand how these psychological levers work, you'll be tempted to use them. And maybe you'll tell yourself it's for good reasons, to help people, to achieve noble goals, to create positive change. But Machiavelli's most chilling insight wasn't about how to gain power. It was about how power changes the person who wields it. The very act of manipulating others, even with good intentions, begins to erode your own moral foundation. You start to see people as objects to be moved rather than individuals to be respected. You begin to justify increasingly questionable behavior because the ends justify the means. You lose the ability to form genuine connections because you're always calculating the angle. This is why Machiavelli's lessons are so dangerous. They work. They absolutely work. But they also transform you into the very thing you might have originally opposed. The question isn't whether you're ready for this kind of power. The question is whether you're ready for what this kind of power will do to you. What do you think? Have you recognized these patterns in your own life? Have you been on the receiving end of Machiavellian manipulation? Or maybe, and this is the uncomfortable question, have you found yourself using these tactics without even realizing it? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology of power, influence, and human nature. Remember, knowledge is power, but wisdom is knowing how to use that power responsibly. Or not to use it at all. Until next time, stay aware, stay questioning, and stay human.